Hello. Hello and welcome to everybody to this afternoon's session. So we have three speakers or three presentations this afternoon, and they're all on the theme of disruption during the time of COVID. My name is Dr. Jane Dennis. I am from Queen Mary, University of London, and I'm chairing the session this afternoon. So the format of the session is going to be, we've got all three presentations, one after the other, and then we've got plenty of time for questions at the time at the end for questions. If you have any questions as we're going through the presentations, feel free to pop them in the chat. And yep, you should have the option to text everybody in the chat there or people directly. So feel free to put them in there or hold them back for the session at the end. So with no further ado, we will move to our first presentation, which is from Eliza Bone, who is actually joining us from Melbourne. So it's almost 2 o'clock in the morning for Eliza. So hats off to Eliza for joining us. But the first presentation is going to be a recording of the talk just because of the time zone differences. So Sebastian, if we could go to the recording, please.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much for the opportunity to present here at SRHE. I'm Dr. Eliza Bone, a senior lecturer at the Melbourne Centre for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm presenting this work on behalf of the rest of my research team, Sarah French, Chris Deneen and Mike Prosser. We've been exploring the impact of the COVID-19 disruption on the perceptions and approaches of teaching academics that are involved in curriculum change projects here at the University of Melbourne. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm making this presentation from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to the elders of the lands on which you're all situated across the world. So here in Australia, the negative impacts of COVID has been felt as elsewhere in the world, with a mass move to online teaching and learning, thousands of job losses as the flow of international students puts budgets under strain, and unfortunately decreases in student satisfaction as they struggle to contend with new modes of learning with staff that are overstretched. On the other hand, there have been numerous reports in the media that university teaching has been irrevocably transformed, and claims that the pandemic has provided unique opportunities for teaching innovation. But some of the more scholarly studies that are emerging, such as this one by Rapanta and colleagues, question whether such innovation has truly materialised. The disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically changed the academic environment and necessitated the adoption of new and often unfamiliar teaching practices. Our project addresses the critical need to better understand how teaching academics are experiencing and responding to these challenges, as well as how these responses may shift over time. We know that universities are complex organisations with multiple faculties, departments and units operating according to different priorities and processes, and often moving in different directions from different starting points. We also know that trying to achieve organisation-wide change in universities is really difficult, given these multiple perspectives, and may be particularly difficult when enacted from a top-down or a management-directed approach. By applying systems thinking, such as that explored by scholars like Michael Fullan and Paul Trowler, we can start to see how these changes might actually be enacted on the ground. For example, in complex systems, changes to the overall state of that system, what might be seen as systemic transformative change, is often preceded by a disruption that destabilises a system. So COVID-19 is a strong disruptive force that is external to the university system, has at least the potential to bring about that transformative change in a system that might otherwise be resistant. So in order to understand the effects of this external disruption and consider the effects, we need to consider the effects on some of the most important components of the system, the teaching academics, remembering that these effects may be diverse, reflecting the divergent experiences and perceptions of academics across the university. So how then to get at this question of how academics are experiencing the disruption of COVID-19? Well, the relational 3P framework developed by Trigwell and Prosser provides a useful framework within which we might seek to understand the experiences of teaching academics during COVID-19 and the possible effects on their teaching approaches. This model articulates the teaching and learning process as a series of relationships that span the individual preconceptions and environmental factors, the process of teaching and learning itself, and the product of that learning process. These relationships are underpinned by a large body of evidence and provide an informative framework for exploring how academics specifically are experiencing the COVID-19 disruption. We were focused on how their academic context may have changed as a result of the pandemic, their experiences of these changes and their teaching approaches during this disruptive phase, with the expectation that COVID-19 was going to affect these aspects of their teaching experience, but we were really interested in exploring the nature of these effects. Which brings me to our research questions, which are split into both the short term, which I'll be focusing on today, and over the longer term as part of the broader research project. We're interested in understanding the experiences and perceptions of academics to this quite stark change in the academic context, as well as how they're approaching their teaching during this time. And over the longer term, we'd like to explore whether there are further changes to these approaches to teaching and whether they're sustained into the future. To explore these questions, we recruited participants who have received grants to complete curriculum innovation projects at the university within the flexible academic programming scheme, for which our research team are academic advisors. And I'll note here that this is a very large research-intensive university in Australia. These participants were from a range of disciplines, academic role levels and subject level responsibilities, who are already interested in teaching and reflective practice and would be able to articulate how their projects and teaching approaches may have changed direction during COVID. There were also participants with whom we had a quite close working relationship, which allowed us to elicit deep responses to our questions. We've held semi-structured interviews with each participant in early 2021, with pilot interviews to trial and refine our questions and techniques. We're currently holding our second round of interviews and plan to hold a third round into 2022 to look at those longer term responses. We chose to analyse the interview transcripts using a phenomenographic approach, which allowed us to characterise and categorise the variation in the ways in which participants were experiencing a phenomenon, in this case the disruption of COVID-19 and the shift to online learning, and allowed us to develop a broad overview of the structure of that variation and the nature of the relationships between the main factors relating to academic experiences. As a team, we read through our full set of transcripts and came to a consensus on three broad dimensions of variation that were evident across these transcripts: teaching and learning, support, and role or identity. The teaching and learning dimension described the ways in which participants approach their teaching, their curriculum design, and their interactions with students. The support dimension described experiences in the context of their perceptions of support from their faculty, department, or peers during the disruption. And the role or identity dimension describe experiences during the disruption in terms of the impact on academics' workload, their sense of security, and their academic identity. Within the teaching and learning dimension, we found the transcripts revealed four categories of perspectives that describe different points of focus within this dimension. The four focal areas being on technology, on themselves as teachers, on student learning, and on student well-being. And I'll provide an indicative quote for each of these different categories. For instance, a technology focus could be exemplified by a quote such as, "I think it was an opportunity for us. We got forced to explore things. And now we will know how to do small quizzes and shoot videos and better structure our Canvas websites," and all these sorts of things. A teacher focus. And so you see this was focused on the tools and the technology. The teacher focus was exemplified by quotes such as, "I mean, it's really difficult when you don't have that physical presence as a teacher to sit down with them, look them in the eye, and then try and encourage them to talk. It's so much more challenging." So in this quote, they're focusing on their role as a teacher. A student learning focus was exemplified by quotes such as, "I can see that there definitely are benefits to pre-recorded lectures in the sense that students can watch them at any time, and if the primary purpose is of communicating concepts, exciting people about the topic." So they were thinking about the student learning experience, even as they were describing some of the technologies they were using. A student wellbeing focus was exemplified by quotes such as, "There was a much stronger sense in 2020 that I had lost that ability to keep an eye on those students who disappeared." So they're very concerned about the student experience. And when we look at the structure of that dimension of teaching and learning, we expected the relationships to be hierarchical in accordance with predictions about the complexity of teaching approaches as articulated by scholars such as Prosser et al. These approaches progress from a focus on their technology to a focus on themselves as teachers, through to a focus on the students, their well-being and their learning. But when we examined the transcripts further, we found participants were really focused on either the well-being and broader experience of their students or on the students' learning experiences. So that our dimensional structure had these two elements separated. Going forward, as the crisis phase subsides, we would expect and hope that teachers would combine these aspects of the student experience into an integrated approach to teaching and learning that considers both the students' well-being and overall experience and their student and their learning as well. So moving on to the support dimension. Within this dimension, we define 4 categories of perceptions and experiences of the support provided to academics during the disruptive phase and the move to online teaching. From those who experienced insufficient support, as exemplified by quotes such as, "It was just so many new technologies at once, I think, and without any guidance or support, I found it really hard." Through to those whose support was mainly technical, we received extraordinary support for the transition to fully online teaching in 2020. Whatever we needed was essentially received, whether it was getting my desk delivered to my home, whatever hardware I needed, everything. Through to those who experienced support that was predominantly collegiate. And I think our willingness as a team to be able to question and challenge the assumptions, we extended that to our tutoring team too. We brought them into that. We're all learning in this together. Through to those who experienced support mainly from at the departmental institutional level. If I was to characterise our department, we've always taken a great deal of pride in the fact that we have good support and we provide good support. Again, relationships between these categories appear to be structured according to an inclusive hierarchy, from perceptions of insufficient support through to those experiences of good support from their institution or department. But from reading the transcripts, the importance of collegiate support far outweighed that from any other source. And that these emergent and supportive learning communities were so common across our cohort of participants will, I think, be very instructive for management to consider when navigating the challenges of the pandemic and designing teaching and learning strategies for the future. So moving on to our our dimension of variation according to role or identity, we're still conducting some preliminary analysis within this dimension and considering the ways in which academics' experiences are structured. One way of categorising this dimension of role is to define the perceptions and experiences in accordance with the Solo taxonomy, where we can work on defining the range of variation across the transcripts. From those who focused on a single aspect of their role or a unistructural approach, which is exemplified by quotes such as, "Well, I don't think I've done that future forward thinking yet. And I think this year is discouraged, to be honest. It's been so hard to plan anything." Through to those who are focused on multiple aspects or relational aspects, to those who perceive their own role within the broader context of academia, teaching, and the higher education sector. Exemplified by quotes such as, "I really do see the role of an academic as evolving, so that it will be hard to be a good academic if you don't have good research, teaching, and engagement. You know how the research is influencing policy, you have industry connections, so what we do has to be better integrated." So further analysis will allow us to categorise these experiences and also to determine if this approach can produce an appropriate and comprehensive representation of the variation in the experiences and perceptions of academics in terms of their role. This brings me to another reflection on this phenomenographic analysis, and that while it can capture the broad categories of responses and define the variation across the responses, it is less effective at capturing the nature of participants' affective experiences, the specific hardships and opportunities experienced by academics during the pandemic. So to complement the phenomenographic approach and draw out some of these additional affective responses, our team have also been using thematic analysis. We've started to identify key focal themes within the framework of the 3P model. First, we identified 4 common themes relating to the academic context, all around the general theme of changes in academic work. Participants consistently reported on a significant increase in workload as a result of the pandemic, as well as a reduction in available resources including most notably a reduction in tutors that meant academic staff had to take on more teaching. We also found that increased precarious work had become a reality for many participants due to delays in contracts, staff layoffs, and uncertainties as to whether contracts would be renewed. However, a common positive theme was that new opportunities had emerged as a result of the pandemic, such as new roles being created for teaching-focused staff who had expertise in online learning. These themes could then be mapped against other themes that were emerging relating to the second category within the 3P model. Teachers' emotions and perceptions of the academic context, and here some relationships between themes start to become apparent. So, for example, the significant increases in workload and reduction in resources both led to experiences of pressure and feeling overwhelmed. And for teaching and research staff, they led to perceptions that time for research was decreased. Precarious work led to increased anxiety, and there was a perception that being in a precarious position was an impediment to quality teaching or innovation. On the other hand, staff also talked about their perceptions that they became valued for their ability to show leadership in teaching and learning, and that they felt there were new possibilities for teaching innovation. All of these perceptions of the academic context have an impact on the ways in which teachers approach their teaching, but there were two overarching themes identified so far in the thematic analysis. Changes in attitudes and approaches to online teaching, and changes in attitudes and approaches to lectures and lecturing that included the perception that traditional lectures were unlikely to return. So how are academics approaching their teaching? Well, by utilising two different methodologies for analysing their interview transcript data, we were able to identify both the broad experiences of academics through phenomenographic analysis and more detailed perspectives on specific aspects of their teaching and learning experiences through thematic analysis. Together, these types of responses are illustrative of the experiences of teaching academics during the COVID-19 disruptive period, and both sets of perspectives will be useful for understanding, managing, and supporting teaching academics in the work going forward. Therefore, we're assured that our use of two methodological approaches is providing a rich set of outcomes, and it is in fact complementary. So our next big question is to see how these academics are responding over the longer term. Our next steps in this project are to continue the phenomenographic analyses to further examine the structural relationships within and between all three dimensions. Our thematic analysis will continue to identify specific key themes and overarching narratives, as well as to develop case studies of individual experiences. We're currently holding a second round of interviews towards the end of this year that will help us understand whether academics have retained these approaches over the longer term, or whether there have been subsequent shifts in their thinking. And with that, I'd just like to thank my colleagues Sarah, Chris and Mike, as well as Higher Education, Research and Development Society of Australasia and the Melbourne CSHE for funding this project. Thank you all so much for coming, and please feel free to get in touch.
Thank you for that, Eliza. Although that was a video recording, Eliza is here and she will be able to take your questions either in chat or afterwards. So my next speakers, or our next speakers this afternoon, are Laura Roper and Camilla Devises Rosenthal from Bournemouth University, and they are going to be talking to us about the benefits of hybrid working. So over to you, Laura.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. So bear with me one moment. Hoping that's working for everyone. Lovely. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to Eliza. Thank you very much for your talk. That's a very early start for you. So just wanted to really start off by introducing ourselves and our background and why we're approaching this today. So Camilla and I, as Jane has said, are from Bournemouth University, and we both approach our roles in kind of a different way. We have both held professional services roles as well as academic roles. So for myself, I have worked in higher education now for 16 years, but until September, I was actually professional services, undertaking research and doing various things, but in a project management role. And it's only actually been since September that I have, as my colleagues say, have crossed the dark side and joined the academic side of Bournemouth University. So I'm very new to it, but I am looking at how we work at the university and how we work in higher education through that lens, you know, that kind of encompasses both sides of the desk, should we say.
Yes, absolutely. And from my point of view, I've worked in education for the past 20 years, mostly as a practitioner, as an academic, but it's only since 2018 that I crossed over into the light. I saw the light and I started working with in service excellence, supporting our organization to develop a positive organizational culture based on my research. So it's the first time that I moved on from a teaching post, even though I do a little bit of teaching, and I work supporting everyone in the organization. So it's been an eye-opening experience for me to see kind of both sides. And that's kind of where we come from and how we complement each other's work.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to sort of set the scene for today's presentation. So we want to talk about how that sort of hybrid working, what it looks like at Bournemouth University, and how we've taken that forward over the last few years. And also try and make some recommendations based on that for areas that we have found have worked really well for us and sort of areas of best practice. So sort of with regards to setting the scene, exactly as Eliza said, you know, we're in a very pivotal time now in higher education. We have been through a very difficult period. You know, we've been through we're going through the global pandemic and with various lockdowns. And this new way of working within the higher education environment has been a real opportunity for us at Bournemouth to really enhance our practice. And we've really embraced that hybrid working model. It's allowed our staff to work together and to fulfill their roles through a combination of both face-to-face and virtual approaches. And this approach allows higher education institutions to really develop that agility and that flexibility that we need. And it has allowed us to focus more on the practices that benefit individual needs, as well as wider institutional needs. And that's an important area that Camilla and I work on quite a lot. We anticipate that the developments within HE around hybrid working are likely to see initiatives in which students are taught across a number of disciplines. So in this instance, it's important to consider the varying skills and the knowledge that students from multiple disciplines possess, and that there will be a need to build curriculum that can support that variety of needs. You know, in this increasingly flexible and complex environment, collaboration, I think, is going to take on a more valuable role in higher education, and creating these communities of hybridity. Doesn't sound like that's even a word, but of, you know, hybrid communities, doing hybrid work, using hybrid practices. And so what we propose is that HEIs should not focus on those academic disciplines alone moving forward. And in fact, working collaboratively between academics and professional members of staff enhances and positively impacts organisational culture. It goes further towards removing that traditional us and them culture that we often see present in higher education environments.
Yes, so one of the things that we did when we started working on this is we started playing with the word hybrid and what that meant, because obviously in the pandemic, it very much meant working from home or working on campus. But for us, it means much more. It also means going into different disciplines. And at Bournemouth University, we embrace a fusion model, which is a model that is for everyone. It's not just for academics, it's for everyone in the university, regardless of who you are. Even for students, we have a fusion model that students use as well. And is the idea that we need to, all of us, be doing education, research and professional practice, regardless of what we do. And that could mean something very simple. So for example, obviously for an academic, that would kind of sit quite well within doing the research, going to teach it, and having some professional practice to keep up to date. But we want to make sure that everyone in the university is doing it. So we have gone to teams and said, for example, to the estates team, and say, the moment that you are researching something in order to improve your practice and you are teaching it to someone else, you are using the fusion model. So we want everyone to embrace that and to make sure that they feel that they can function in all of those parts. And that may mean that they are given a little bit more time, to go and investigate something. So it's looking in creative ways of making it happen. Fusion has been something that up to now in our university, it was just kind of a word, but I think in the last 2 to 3 years, it has become to something that we are all embodying, and it's in very many different ways. So for example, when Laura was saying, breaking down the them and us culture, some of the jobs that we've been doing really allow us to do that. When I first started working in service excellence, with the head of service excellence, I went to see some teams to see what they did. And I was in awe of the amount of knowledge they have, on the support that they give students. I'll give you an example. We had I went to visit the admissions team and see what they were doing. And I was so impressed by the care, the compassion, the amount of knowledge that they have. And I came back and I told the head of service excellence, Susanna, I told about it. And for her, it was like, well, yeah, I know that. And I was like, yeah, but we need to tell all academics, because in order for us to be standing in front of our students, how many people has to be behind us, but also in front of, for our students to be in front of us, all of those people are integral. So it's really important that we see everyone in the university as a peer scholar, because without each other we wouldn't be able to function, and that has also meant that we've played a little bit with our power structures. So for example, last year I was the program leader of the foundation year, and Laura was the head of accreditations, and she started teaching in my foundation year because she's an incredible teacher. I discovered her, and she started working with us. And this year, she's the program leader of the foundation year, and I am teaching in the foundation year. So we have kind of broken that kind of power thing. On the other hand, Laura is also my PhD student. So we have a different kind of relationship. So we are playing with the type of relationships and the type of roles that we have, to make sure that we all kind of can sit in different spaces and do different things and can challenge the status quo, which is a really interesting thing for us.
Lovely, thank you. Yes, so I'm on my best behaviour because my PhD supervisor is here, and then Camilla's on her best behaviour because her programme leader's here. So it has created this wonderful dynamic and this sort of real, we feel like a community, and I think we're seeing that grow more and more. And I think as part of that change to those hybrid working practices, there has been a real increase in an opportunity to embrace our interdisciplinarity. Bering did some work in 2019 that really highlighted just how important interdisciplinary teaching is. And the fact that it develops such meaningful interactions between teams, between sort of subcultures within a higher education institution. And it allows that opportunity to really discuss and break down how individuals can work together to that shared goal. And I think our fusion model has really kind of enabled us to do that and really start to break those boundaries down. And this work has really included embracing and respecting different forms of expertise that staff members from different areas of the institution can bring. And interdisciplinarity creates new avenues through that creativity, that innovation, and it's been far more successful at problem solving than when studied with only one discipline. And that is through that use of a diverse range of perspectives and skill sets and interpretations. I think whereas traditionally we see within an HEI, we do very much sort of, we have our hierarchy, we have our sort of, our departments and our faculties, and the management, the leadership sits within those faculties. We are moving beyond that now. And I think this hybrid working is really allowing us to start to seek out and see which other opportunities we have there. So I think this can be seen as a really exciting time for us.
Yes, so obviously we have to talk about the importance of theory and how we've made it into practice. So we have looked, in order to embed this positive organizational culture, we have looked into ideas around positive psychology, ideas such as positive developing a positive experience for all, appreciative inquiry, so making sure that we go to see what works in order to make things happen. We also look at strength-based approaches that are people-focused, because it's all about the people. Our institutions are all about the people that are there. We may have incredible buildings and amazing tech, but without the people, they would just be empty spaces, I would argue. And we look at humanizing working approaches. So what we've done is we've used the humanizing framework developed by Todres et al., originally in health and social sciences, and we've adapted it to the idea of humanizing higher education. And within that framework that looks at a range of words, of things that humanize or the humanized experiences, we have tested them against some of the things that we do. And then we ask people to kind of discuss about it and how they feel. We also have looked at positive relational energy, which is the idea of the heliotropic effect, which actually means that all kind of organic beings tend towards the sun. And in our view, and in the view of positive organizational scholarship, it means towards a positive thing, positive deviance being a very important thing. So we are looking into those sort of things. So we can see that in our culture already, in the way that our leaders are sending messages that are full of kindness, that are full of compassion, self-compassion. We've been given some extra time from all the work we've done through the pandemic, but also it has allowed us to break boundaries. I never thought that we would be able to develop meaningful relationships online. And for me, during the pandemic, that has been one of the most incredible things. The fact that you have that person in front of you, maybe in their private space, and they open that to you, has allowed us to develop a really much more informal and I would say strong relationship within our teams, which is a fantastic thing. And all of that is based on the idea that we practice with an embodied relational understanding, which basically means practicing with our head, which is the knowledge that we all have, that we all gain from what we are learning and what we're practicing. Our hand, which is how we do things, the way we approach things, the way that we treat others, the way that we go on about our day doing things, but also our heart, which is not just about our emotions, but is the meaningful relationships that we develop with others in order to make things happen. And what we believe is that if we practice with those areas, we will actually deliver service excellence in everything that we do at Bournemouth University. We've had a really good feedback from many teams in the different faculties, and it's really great because sometimes you go to meetings and you start hearing words, and words create worlds, and it's not the words that we are saying, but it's the words that other people are saying. So it's really fascinating when you're in a meeting and the CEO mentions that humanizing is really important because, and you think, I made it now, this is fantastic, and all other things that we've been able to do. For me, it's a very proud thing. I developed this PLAT as part part of my doctorate. Obviously, it wasn't the only thing I did to get my doctorate. I had to do another 80,000 words, but it's great to see that the theory that we are developing is actually filtering and embedding into our lived experiences in our organization, because we believe that is by people doing it and living it that actually this positive organizational culture will kind of get into all the different hybrid teams and eventually filter into society. Because if we support students to develop this positive organizational culture, then they will go into their working spaces with this idea and hopefully enrich society and make a better world, really. That's kind of what it is.
5 minutes.
Thank you. And absolutely. And I professional members of staff engaging in research and education within their own roles, whilst also collaborating with academics to enhance that student experience, is going to really give us that more consistent approach that we want to see. And I think this way of working, this way that we've sort of been embracing, is really helping with that cohesiveness and that collaboration. And we've seen individuals who are feeling far more empowered and feeling that they are a more important member of their team. That mindful collaboration and purposeful communication between staff, where everyone feels listened to and able to speak up without fear of judgment, it really enables that critical discussion and development of those common themes across the work, as well as developing that positive culture within a team. One important aspect of this way of working is to have a responsive and effective use of communication strategies across disciplines and job roles. And that's obviously become far more important over the last few years with our virtual lives that we have lived. And this has really helped to sort of facilitate and enhance collaboration and really worked hard to reduce those barriers, across the silos of working practice. Some of the ways that that's been done is through meaningful feedback, encouraging the sharing of ideas and opinions, and enabling staff to work collaboratively and ensure the coordination and consensus-based decision-making. And that collaborative process has resulted in a high level of integration and produced an improved level of scholarly engagement. It's also been shown to enhance job satisfaction, staff morale, and that sense of belonging. So whichever hybrid way of working is embraced by each member of the team, bringing their own expertise and perspective, a culture fostering creativity and innovation is developed. And ultimately, that transparency, that openness, honesty, genuineness that we are embracing here is key to that successful development of these hybrid ways of working. We've just got all our references in there for you, but thank you so much, everyone. I think we've got about a minute left, so I don't want to overrun. So thank you so much for listening to our presentation. We really hope you have found it interesting.
Yes, thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you very much. And I can see some virtual clapping going on there as well. So thank you. We will hold questions until the end. And just a reminder, if you have any, you can pop them into the chat. So Laura, could you stop sharing your screen?
Yep, sorry, my mouse decided to disappear there. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our third and final talk of this afternoon is from Vicky Trowler at the University of Huddersfield. And she is going to be talking to us about student engagement in lockdown and beyond. So over to you, Vicky.
I'm going to do something a little different. So I am going to, if you give me half a second, I'm going to share a screen again. And in a second, I will have it here. There we go. Hi everyone. This paper is Engaging with the Remote University,
what teaching and learning in lockdown teaches us about student engagement in higher education. Student engagement in higher education continues to enjoy academic and policy attention internationally, with policymakers attempting to measure it and enhance it, while researchers attempt to define it, build it, investigate it, trigger it, theorize it, critique it, or evaluate it. Our intention in this paper is to take forward critical engagement with the construct through examining what extreme circumstances, namely the widespread lockdown during the coronavirus pandemic, reveal about how students are required to engage in order to be successful in HE. If we turn back the clock to before the pandemic, to consider what understandings of SE dominated the discourse, we see the uncritical importing of the Fredericks, Blumenfeld and Paris model, which prioritized student engagement as a metaconstruct with 3 dimensions, namely behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. We have 2 main critiques of this model. Firstly, that it locates SE within the individual rather than at the interface between students and the HEI. And secondly, that it fails to capture adequately the multidimensional and dynamic nature of SE in HE. Our own 2017 model expands their model, paying particular attention to the higher order facets of engagement that are demanded of students in HE. Here we see the baseline Fredericks et al. Facets, namely affective, what the student feels, behavioral, what the student does, and cognitive, what the student thinks. These are the lower order facets. To these, we've added higher order facets, namely sociocultural, how the student feels, which is about their values, political, how the student acts, which is about their agency, and critical, how the student thinks, which is about their orientation to authority. We've also added new dimensions. The Fredericks et al. Model only considered congruent engagement, whereas we recognize that oppositional forms of engagement, as distinct from non-engagement, are also valid. We recognize that students can engage differentially across these different facets at the same time, for example, by really enjoying a module while not being intellectually challenged by it, and their engagement can wax and wane over time across these different facets, responding dynamically to changing circumstances across their lives, inside and outside of their learning environments. One such change in circumstances was the imposition of lockdown in many parts of the world. Lockdown saw the wide-scale adoption of emergency remote teaching. With universities prevented by lockdown from providing the physical structure and context, students needed to create that for themselves. Students were called on to project the universities, or the disciplines or the programs, sociocultural values and norms onto their own environments, to marshal their own agency, and to deploy their own critical authority. These forms of engagement demanded of HE students were materially different from the engagement required of compulsory education level students. While in practice these facets are interrelated, it is useful to separate them conceptually, since it is possible to be engaged congruently on some, but oppositionally, or not at all, on others. So what does the evidence suggest about how students fared across these facets? In normal practice, students are acculturated progressively into the values and mores of their university, discipline and program through sustained efforts from themselves and their teachers. When lockdown came, students were asked to observe our protocols and to embody our values congruently in how they worked, revised, submitted their work for assessment, etc. Were they able to do this? Had they internalized these values enough to enable this? Did they cheat deliberately or unwittingly as a result of not having internalized the values sufficiently or having rejected them? Did they consciously challenge or undermine the values because they saw them as increasingly irrelevant in their remote contexts? Staff at many universities have noted an increase in academic integrity cases over this time, and Lancaster and Codron reported doubling of use of file-sharing sites during the pandemic, which they attribute to the move to online teaching and assessment. This suggests that for at least some students, this has been an issue. The development of students' authorial voice and the congruent exercise of student agency is traditionally nurtured in and out with the HE classroom. In the context of ERT, students needed to claim their own authorial voice and assert their own perspectives into their creation of knowledge. Yet the situated nature of cognition can undermine this. In a home where they were the child, students living with their parents, they were positioned as consumers and not producers of knowledge. In a home where they were the parent, student parents, they were required to be full-time caregivers and homeschoolers, focused on the passive transmission of others' knowledge to their children, and not on being the authors of their own knowledge. The space to construct knowledge through congruent engagement or to challenge what constitutes knowledge through oppositional engagement was not readily afforded by the ERT situation for many students. Did students see themselves as having valid perspectives to contribute? Were they able to offer their own perspectives, understandings, arguments and conclusions, or were they merely seeking input? McKay et al. Reveal that students on their program under study reported lower Likert responses, greater disagreement, during the period of lockdown with the "I learned a lot" item. This suggests that during the period, students questioned not only their cognitive engagement, as suggested by McKay et al., but also confidence in their own perspectives. Critical engagement is central to HE. It's what makes HE higher and is seen as indexical of the success of HE, according to Barnett, 1997. In the context of ERT, students needed to construct authority for themselves and project it onto the appropriate objects, such as literature sources for assignments, forms to complete a deadline extension request, or lecturers who appear as a head in a box on a screen. How did students relate to this authority without the security of the containing structure and context the physical university provided? Did they fall back on the comfortable safety of reproduction and regurgitation, non-engagement? Did they risk voicing their own views, holding them in dynamic tension with received views, as in congruent engagement, when they may have been uncertain what their own views were, given the uncertainty and chaos around them? Or did they engage from a contradictory paradigm in oppositional engagement, with the accompanying risks of operating in a world of fake news and conspiracy theories, where skepticism often masks a political agenda and notions of criticality are destabilized? Pre-pandemic, McGrew et al. 2018 concluded that students struggle to evaluate information critically, and this is unlikely to have improved since. Reflecting on the pathways to engagement, which we've introduced in another paper, we look at different ways of engaging with the challenges that the context of ERT has introduced. Firstly, looking at affective engagement. How can we foster positive emotions and regulate negative emotions through reappraisal to promote affective engagement, whether remotely through ERT, through blended or online learning, or in our post-lockdown teaching and learning classrooms, laboratories and studios? McCune suggests that affective dimensions of teaching were material to some students' willingness to engage, including perceived staff enthusiasm for their subjects, as well as staff-student rapport, so perceiving the environment as friendly encouraged more attention to and greater enjoyment of the course. Staff engagement as a necessary precursor for SE is a familiar theme, but one worth bearing in mind during post-lockdown conditions where staff are under greater pressure owing to increasing workloads, burnout, stress, or refocused duties, all of which can be evidenced by viewing tweets on academic Twitter. We've suggested motivation as a pathway to behavioral engagement. Motivation is spurred, according to Wigfield and Eccles, by students perceiving that completing the task would produce sufficient benefits, that they either currently have or are able to develop the capacity to complete the task successfully. The former speaks to establishing task value, and the later to the development of mastery goals. Mastery goals stand in contrast to task goals, where the goal is simply to complete the task for compliance purposes, and task avoidance, where the goal is to dodge having to complete the task. So how then can we encourage motivation through establishing task value and promoting mastery goals in a remote, blended or post-lockdown context? Here, McCune has suggested the role of assessment in establishing task value. Mastery goals also involve projection into the future to recognize the value of the skills developed through the completion of the current task and for the completion of other future tasks. And G suggests that students' motivation to engage with their studies relies on their ability to imagine themselves into their future identities that might arise from their studies. Of course, in the context of the worldwide disruption arising from the pandemic and the associated impact on social and economic normality, this ability to imagine or to project into the future can be hampered by the prevailing uncertainties. We've suggested resilience as a pathway to cognitive engagement. How then can we nurture resilience and increase our students' awareness of their own coping strategies so as to foster a healthy balance between problem solving, support seeking and escape in these challenging circumstances? And here McCune stresses the importance of authentic learning experiences, which are personally meaningful and relevant to students, socially relevant to the field, and in harmony with the nature of the discipline, as observed by Stein, Isaacson, and Andrews. This engagement with the ways of thinking and practicing of their subject area helps the students to develop a sense of what is meaningful and relevant to them. And here again, McCune stresses the teaching styles and the quality of explanations as being particularly highlighted by students as being beneficial to cognitive engagement. We've suggested that belonging might provide a pathway to socio-cultural engagement, as we understand it as shifting, processual and multidimensional, and involves a reciprocal relationship between belonging and the politics of belonging, so being seen to belong. Belonging doesn't necessarily imply congruent engagement. Oppositional engagement is also possible as part of the process of sense-making when students feel safe and at home enough to take the risk. So how can we cultivate belonging and advance peer relationships, build rapport between students and staff, and nurture congruent values when the distance may loom large and may disrupt the process of sense-making? Work placements have been suggested by McCune as having a very marked effect on students' willingness to engage, and specifically the social integration into a research community as being material and as helping students to adopt the values of that community. So, for example, feeling like a scientist has a significant impact on students' depth of engagement in their studies. And while placements obviously have been difficult under lockdown, there have been ways of offering placements and internships to students in online or blended environments, and with lockdown hopefully easing at some point in the future, these possibilities will arise again more fully. We've suggested self-efficacy as a pathway to political engagement. So how can we promote self-efficacy and help students build an awareness of their internal and external resources to foster reappraisal and encourage autonomy in a context of constrained agency where resources are being stretched to their limits? And here we look again at McCune, who suggests students being given independence and responsibility within authentic learning experiences leads to these students growing in confidence in their academic abilities and increasing their engagement. In a context where students and staff feel their agency constrained through circumstances associated with post-lockdown adaptations to teaching and learning, supporting self-efficacy becomes much more significant. We've suggested that reflectivity might provide a pathway to critical engagement. Elsewhere, we've noted that reflection allows the development of understanding rather than mere problem solving during the learning process, and that reflection can lead to the development of self-regulation and metacognitive skills, provided that this involves constructive or problem-solving self-reflection rather than rumination or self-focused self-reflection. Forming judgment involves the use of criticality and is informed by reflectivity. How can we build reflectivity and identify students' reflection strategies so that we can help shift their reflection where appropriate from rumination to more constructive forms? Examples we've come across in the literature include, for example, Ray et al.'s description how, for working class students, the strangeness of elite HE environments themselves provoked reflectivity for their working class students as they negotiated movement between very different cultural worlds. So providing something out of the ordinary for students to reflect on might help with that. And elsewhere, McCune describes the role of authentic learning experiences in foregrounding the messiness of science, highlighting contradictory findings and contestations in interpretations, and the effect of this on students' willingness to engage critically with the material under discussion. Immersion in a research community and the agency developed from growing their own academic confidence heightened the likelihood of their feeling like a scientist and increased their preparedness to engage with research findings in a questioning manner. Next of lockdown and post-lockdown teaching and learning, the challenge is to facilitate student reflection that is constructive, to avoid the pitfalls of rumination, and to nurture critical engagement. One of the central themes that has been running through much of this discussion has been that of identity. Kuhn argues that when an individual can imagine themselves as part of a particular world, they are more likely to engage with the activities valued in that context. This evokes the imagined communities that students construct dynamically, whose values inform their actions and towards which they orientate their trajectories. We propose that where these imagined communities overlap with the research or practice community students encounter during placement or in the course of their studies, students' engagement will more readily involve the higher order facets of engagement, namely sociocultural, political and critical, and with it a greater likelihood of success in HE. And just in conclusion, it's important to remember that student engagement is reciprocal. It's not just about students engaging, it is also about engaging students. In the same way that UL Davis refers to belonging and the politics of belonging, who is recognized as having the right to claim belonging, these other higher order facets of student engagement require reciprocity. It's not just about students constructing knowledge, but also about our recognizing their contributions as valid. Students' exercise of socio-cultural, political and critical engagement through belonging, agency and authority requires us reciprocally to recognize their status as members, agents and holders of their own authority in their studies. As we look back on the lessons of lockdown, we should not lose sight of the importance of fostering these other higher order facets of engagement to help our students in their success in higher education. Thank you for your attention during this animation, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Vicky. Okay, thank you very much, Vicky, for that presentation. So we move on to the final part of the session this afternoon, which is the Q&A session. So I've got a question to start off with, which I was initially going to ask towards Laura and Camilla, but then as I was formulating it, I thought it might also be relevant for Elisa as well. So you were talking